welcome to another episode of the Brookbanks Podcast. I'm Sophie Watkins, part of the central team here at Brookbanks, and your podcast for this episode. Today I've got with me Lee Witts, who's Group Director for our Land Development and Communities team, and Richard Moorcroft as well. So first of all, I'll pass over to Richard for you to introduce yourself for everyone.
Hi everyone, Richard Moorcroft, as Sophie says, Group Operations Director, Chartered Civil Engineer, and I've spent most of my career on the delivery stage side of projects.
Fab, over to you, Lee.
Hello everyone, I'm Lee Witts, the Group Director for Land Development and Communities here at Brookbanks, a career now spanning 28 years in civil engineering, transportation, infrastructure and environment.
Fab. So we're here today to talk about the gap that exists between planning, engineering and actually delivering projects, guys. So I'm sure you've got a lot to say about this because what happens on paper very rarely obviously happens in reality. So first of all, Richard, do you want to get us started as why does the gap exist?
Yeah, well, I think it's great that Lee's here actually, because we've got an expert who spent a lot of time at the front end dealing with technical issues through the planning process, and myself who's seen it all at the delivery stage. So you've got both bookends here of the development process. But you're right, it's a great question. There is a gap between what you do at planning and what can be built. And I think there's a bit of a tension there sometimes. And like the two areas can often be in separate worlds. Planning can sometimes be aspirational because it's about possibility, it's about policy, it's about placemaking. Engineering tends to be more constrained. It's about viability, what you can get adopted, implementation, and operation. So two very different things they're pulling on your site. Again, so the planning discipline is often rewarded for imagination. The engineering discipline's accountable for making that happen in reality. And I think the system itself amplifies that divide sometimes. I mean, every applicant, all they want is a permission. Local authorities, all they want is a site that's policy compliant. Everyone wants momentum. So there's a sort of mantra there to make things go quickly where we can. And I suppose with engineering, there is a certain process to follow. There's certain bits of information you need to de-risk things. So the two aren't always on the same page. Whether you agree, Lee, with that?
I do, and the interesting thing is that there's a lot of this industry treats an outline planning consent. So we can talk about the differences between the outline and detail and where the gaps lie as we go. But let's start with outline. There is a somewhat of a consensus that outline permission is the end goal, and once you've done that, everything that follows is almost a reset in a way. So planning conditions, looking at viability, looking at phasing, and a pitfall I've seen numerous times over my career are teams and developers maybe racing slightly too quickly towards securing that consent and not really building in ahead of time what needs to come after. And it's not a case of one piece of work and the second piece of work don't speak to each other, because they do. But I think a successful outcome ultimately for a planning permission, as in a spade in the ground, it's built and it's occupied, needs people probably like you and I, Richard, to come together to agree the sequence of what needs to happen ahead of time so that you're not repeating work. And it's probably that repetition where you and I meet in the middle when we haven't been able to cohesively take a scheme through all within Brookbanks, let's say. Sometimes we retrospectively come in as a consultant to look at other people's work, to find ways to bridge that gap after the fact. And it's not as smart a play as just getting it done in sequence and planning ahead. What we've found, I think now, Richard, is that common ground where I will know what engineers need to see or expect to see once an outline permission has been granted. So they will look at a pack of information. They will expect certain things to have been done or resolved. I I know that's not always the case, though, isn't it? So you're sometimes blind at the start of your process. Let's say reviewing planning conditions and looking at taking detail forward, where ordinarily you would have liked certain steps to happen but haven't.
Yeah, it's a good point, Lee. Um, I think when you separate out planning and delivery, to use those two general
Mm,
terms, I mean, planning drawings aren't supposed to be construction
yeah.
drawings at all. They're there to serve a purpose. They're there to secure a consent, to demonstrate that policy compliance, to show a concept. Um, and you have got inbuilt flexibility within these plans. And I think that is a good thing. You need that because things do change. Um, there's a lot of technical detail that is deferred to later on in the process, because you just don't know now. You don't have enough time to find out the answers, or it's just not efficient to spend the time doing that. And I think the central thing in all of this is, we're not sort of saying you must submit construction drawings for planning. I think what you need to do is do enough behind the scenes to make sure your concept does work. De-risk it as far as possible, I think is what we're getting at. And I think sometimes the planning drawings, they do what they need to do, but they perhaps just miss a little bit at the end, which can sometimes trip people up when you get a bit down the road.
We have to sometimes educate the clients, the wider consultant team, to the fact that yes, a master plan rightly is a beautification of the parameters. So yes, this is where spatially everything is going to go. There must be that science behind it, though. So just thinking about, let's say, pick a specific example, so buffer zones or public open space. Also thinking about the three-dimensional element of it as well, Richard, and that's probably a, a, a pitfall you see more often than others. Has this been considered in the third dimension? Typically, it does nowadays. Not always, and that's a bit of an engineering quandary that you've got to face when there's a master plan presented to you. It's gone through all of the appropriate checks and balances, but when you actually need to now engineer this for reserved matters, for detailed consent, there might be some unpicking to do. I think it's important that from my side of the fence, with the team taking it through planning, and as you rightly say, the parameters ought to be fluid to a certain degree to allow adjustment and refinement at the detailed stage. But we've still got to make sure that spatially everything is buildable. You can place it; it does work, and it's a common pitfall on your plans and delivery is when that hasn't materialized, and there are some awkward calls to make to say, unfortunately, spatially, we're going to have to move things, and that there's invariably a cost and time delay with that.
So, Richard, that's obviously one of the gaps, is obviously reality of planning into your sort of spatial awareness and 3D mapping. Where are the other gaps then in terms of commercially and sort of program consequences? Where are those key gaps that you see time and time again through projects and schemes?
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. So I suppose where you have got these gaps is if something does have to change through a constraint that perhaps hasn't been mapped through the planning process. There might be some ground conditions that haven't been fully explored. You've got a new risk that's then been introduced to the project, and say, for example, if that land's contaminated, you've now got to go through a process of finding out what it is. What can and can't you do with it? Do you have to take it off site? Can you remediate it? What impacts has that got on your master plan? Can it still be developed? Has it got to be ring fenced and left alone? So all of this, there's a big sort of domino effect here about the plans that you've agreed at planning stage could all have to change. The master plan could have to be sort of torn up and start again. If you're losing units, that's going to impact on viability. So I think it brings us all back to that point about doing enough to de-risk something as far as you can, as early as you can in the process, and just trying to do that extra layer of sort of technical due diligence and engineering to explore those, to satisfy yourself you've got no glaring gaps in your surveys, your information. You've explored the risks as far as you can, and on the flip side, you've explored the opportunities as much as you can. Program-wise, again, if you've got to go through that process, it's only going to add delays onto the back end of your process, to sort of getting things to site.
The helpful advice that we would give at the planning preparation stage, people tend to focus on the validation requirements. So what do I need to do for this planning application to receive consent? Local planning authorities all around the country, they have their different validation requirements depending on scale of developments, so on and so forth. And there's a checklist of I need this plan and they need to see this report and so on. Working with Richard for as long as I have, and knowing what the through line looks like, it's advising in the right way. So what you do early on, and we'll keep with your ground conditions point, Richard, is this survey, this intrusive survey, we feel like there might be a landfill or asbestos. If you get an inkling from public available information, desktop studies, that there are potential nasties in the ground, the survey that you would carry out early on our recommendation might not be required for the validation purposes of the planning consent. We might not need the local authority to see it, but I think for the outlay of a few £1,000 or a week or a month, 2 months of additional time spent early allows you to unlock those issues and know ahead of time what's in front of you. So it's not necessarily information that you have to put in front of the local authority for the planning review purpose, but it's hugely helpful for what follows. And it takes that period of gap away that Richard's just explained. Having all of that information up front allows you to flow through much more freely, smoothly, following the outline permission, knowing that, okay, I identified this a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. I know exactly what I need to do at this point in time. And it goes back to one of my earlier points of Richard's team, or engineers at large. They need to have that baseline data, and if it's not there, they simply can't move forward. So it's you stop the clock. I'm sorry, we're going to have to carry out the survey. It's and time of year is quite important as well. You can't do certain things over winter, let's say, or over the summer period. You need the right climate. So the gap can be multiplied based on bad luck of timing, simply. So having it all done and recommending to the client team ahead of time, you will need this, so let's do it now. Let's know the problems ahead of us. Let's look at the opportunities ahead of us as well. It might unlock positives. It's not all just about the negatives. But knowledge truly is power, I think, in this regard. Getting information in early.
And it is a balancing act, Lee, isn't it? Because if you look at a mega site that's got many thousands of homes on it, you wouldn't necessarily recommend that you're going to go and do a full intrusive survey across a very large piece of land through the planning process. That's going to be very much a phased approach, isn't it? Probably purely down to the cost of doing that exercise and the disruption to do it. So I think it's like you say, a targeted sort of survey and analysis to get you enough information to remove some of the key assumptions that you've got goes a long way.
Absolutely.
And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but part of me thinks as well it comes down to sort of that expert knowledge and guidance and call. Local geology information, would play a big part in that. I'm sure, knowing whether that land is going to be, at risk of a certain type of element, whether that's, as you say, Lee, like asbestos or any other site of environmental sort of impact. And knowing when to make those calls, as you say, it's mitigating the cost, isn't it, versus actually do we spend the money now and make sure that we reduce those risks as much as possible so they have a smaller limit as, further down the line.
It starts, Sophie, it starts before we've been commissioned. If you're invited to look at a piece of land and and you're told, okay, can we please have these services from you? Again, good practice is to have a quick sweep of the area, as you say. That there's a lot of free, publicly available information online. If you know where to search, you can spend a few minutes and have an awful lot of information at your fingertips. Not only will it uncover potential nasties, there are some good news stories as well that again you want to put into that scope and fee proposal for a client. So a piece of land might actually be quite clean. I'll put that in quotes from a contaminant point of view, from a noise, air quality point of view, for good transport links, etc. Whereas competing sites in the local authority area might not have that benefit. So within the scope and the body of work, you might be wanting to actually reinforce the positives of the site in that sort of planning journey. It's not just all about the mitigating the bad things. Promoting the good is also as important. So knowing the land you're about to design, I think, is extremely important from the good and the bad.
And we're obviously talking about this, as we've sort of implied, blank canvas in terms of land, but I suppose that's even more important with things like brownfield sites. It's what existing utilities infrastructure is in place, what you're going to sort of unearth in the ground that might have been there for a long time. That might, potentially save you cost savings too, in terms of, not having to plan in those utilities infrastructure from the beginning. I suppose it's on that flip side. Richard, is there anything in particular on that you'd like to add from a civils perspective in terms of inheriting sites that sort of already have prior use?
I think it's a double-edged matter. I suppose if you talk about brownfield development, yes, you might have more opportunities in the fact that you may have services to the boundary or within the boundary, and some of those services might be or could have been of a generous capacity. You always you certainly have more opportunities from an earthworks point of view as well. Again, if you're redeveloping a piece of commercial land that has had concrete slabs in there, you've often got a source of material you can reuse once tested. But again, the risks do escalate and ramp up back to that ground condition. I think, Lee, we'll keep circling back to that. Is that when you're dealing with a brownfield site, you're almost always going to have a harder ride when it comes to contamination and the quality of the ground that you're dealing with, and that can make the planning process a lot trickier as well. So I think it's a pendulum effect, Sophie. I think there's good and bad.
I'd add to that. I think that the planning system, without going granular, is very attuned to that on brownfield sites as well. So they will be expecting a higher degree of interrogation and scrutiny through the planning sequence, so that they're satisfied they're stamping a deliverable scheme, and that's probably another word of the day. Really, is that is deliverability. Positive delivery. Can you do what you say? My side of the fence is saying that we can, and Richard's side, I'd say, you're then proving statements that we make sometimes years before, and it's that continuity of work and assessment that befalls you, and that brownfield point is incredibly important. Rarely in an outline, even on a brownfield, do we have to interrogate in detail the contaminants. It's insofar as we don't need a prescriptive remediation strategy, but we do need to know what's there. Richard, what you then need to contend with is foundations and road depths and the actual specification of material, all rolling on from what has been done previously. So it just goes back to that point. If it's not there, it simply just pauses a project until that information is known. And it's time and program bleed instantly if it's not been carried out.
I think there's in my head there's 6 predictable hotspots you see on every site that sort of define how successful it's going to be, and it's the sort of measure of the planning optimization versus the reality when you get to delivery. And those 6 things are levels and drainage. The earthworks are often a killer of sites if not done correctly or done at the outset. As you say, Lee, planning layouts used to be a lot of focus on the 2D perspective of a layout. Rarely was top topography considered. Obviously, it's great to see more recently that detailed earthwork strategies are being done to support the planning process, and that's only a good thing. The next one is the highway sort of map for the site. So I'm thinking more the adoptability side of that as well. So you may get a ticket, but is what's been put forward going to be acceptable to the local highway authority to take on as public highway? Utilities, environmental constraints as well. So sort of BNG, flood compensation. How much detail have we gone into to look at the extent of the EA's flood map and the accuracy of that against the master plans that we're supporting to develop? Nutrient neutrality is still a thing that's in the realm, and a big one for me is phasing and how that comes forward, especially on these bigger sites. Phasing is often not thought about until later on, and it's an issue where you've got numerous phases that perhaps depend on each other from a levels or from a drainage perspective. You might have SUDS features that are not forecast to be built until later on down the chain of the program. So what's the interim solution? How does the site work until those come forward? And it's all of that kind of stuff that if you can add that bit of detail during the planning process, you can vastly improve the deliverability of that site. And you can come up with the ideas now, can't you?
Yeah, very much so. I'm smiling because you reminded me of an anecdotal story. It was a large residential scheme. It was a few thousand homes. We were brought in after the outline consent to sort of resolve some technical issues as they were emerging. Phase 1, top of the hill. Basically, I'm generalising now. All of the SUDS was phase 5, over a kilometre away. So are we designing and building a phase 1 housing scheme with no SUDS, no drainage? Or are we literally going to pipe with easements a kilometre down to basins over here, not knowing what the detailed housing arrangement looks like? Thinking about all those years break between what phase 1 and phase 5 will be, and it completely circles back to that point, Richard, you make of does the immediate environment around me work? So does that phase 1 work? Does it link into the phase 2, the phase 3, etc.? It's a common trap at the outline stage to think about the entire piece and the parameters of the whole. That's very important. You can't escape that. What does it look like when everything's built and occupied? Does it all work? But of course, you don't build everything in one go. It is phased, it is sectioned. A house builder, just keeping with residential for a moment, a house builder might sort of retain phase 1 and build it. They might sell a phase 2 while they're continuing to build out phase 1. There's all these permutations, and what's the degree of comfort people like you and I, Richard, and our teams, what do we need to give these various developers and bodies so that everybody feels satisfied in their own pockets, that they have something that is reflective of planning, that they can deliver it in detail, and ultimately is viable and cost effective. We mustn't forget about the actual commercial aspect of all of this as well. It's got to return for the developers.
So I suppose that's the difference then between sort of just getting permission and actually having permission with confidence that we can roll things out, that we've identified the gaps. So I suppose Richard and Lee, Richard, I'll come to you first. What's your top tip then to strike that balance? Because clearly, you could say, right, well, we'll go in and we'll do all of the scopes and we'll look at everything in one go and we'll throw loads of money at it because we want the best picture possible. But in reality, that is very costly. So how do we get that balance then?
I think it's having a consultant partner working on the project that understands that balance in detail. And you're right. The wrong thing to do is spend all of the money up front and try and de-risk everything to the nth degree and survey everything, because things invariably change. Surveys have a lifespan. You can often end up redoing things as you go down the sort of program of a site, especially on larger sites. So again, I suppose the key things I recommend is having some early engineering input during the process up to submission as well, rather than after submission. Having technical engineering input to the parameter plans, so being able to give some advice on the sort of development as it comes forward on the levels, on the drainage corridors, on the geometry, so making sure that's baked in earlier on. And I think what I'm trying to get to is reality-based master planning, really. So making sure that does evolve into something that's very much deliverable. Um, I like to use this term cross-disciplinary squads as well. So making sure planners, engineers, ecologists, QS, they're all acting as one team as well, and sort of driving forward to get that best result for the clients. Making sure that team or squad have got clear rules of engagement. Nothing should go to planning unless it's technically credible and everyone's sort of happy, signed off on it. And making sure our clients understand what we're doing and what our MO is, because there's planning drawings that set expectations at the start can become very expensive to unwind as you sort of get further into the program.
Wholeheartedly agree. I think to add, don't assume what worked on your previous piece of land will work again. You need to know the land you're on specifically. And I mean the physicality of it, also what's underneath, and typically also, the things you don't think about that you can't see, the acoustics and the air quality and root protection areas and things like that. These are small hurdles, but if you don't jump them and they're bunched up, it can create a hell of a calamity as the program goes forward. Richard landed it really well there. It's on us to educate the client, to let them know that what we're delivering is it's value added, outcome based, rather than this is policy compliant, because those two things are quite far from each other. A policy compliant technical solution for transport or for hydrology or for ground conditions, you name the discipline. Policy compliant doesn't mean correct. It does in policy terms, but in actual deliverability, what is built, how much it costs, how fast it can happen, does it give you the outcome you wanted? Let's think about placemaking. Of course, every developer will like to have the output. It's years in the making. They will want to create a specific place, a specific environment. Technical solutions and engineering don't necessarily unlock that. You need to have expertise behind it and delivery skill to know that it's the right solution. You might have 5 options in front of you. One will be closer than the rest. So it's just engaging the team early planning technicals versus Richard's sort of later detailed engineering, and having that continuity through, so that it's the right solution, not just policy compliant.
Sounds good. So I suppose we're coming to the end of our podcast episode now. Let me put it out here for a question for you both. So out of all the things that tend to get lost down the gap, what is the thing that you see time and time again?
I think it's a lot. I'll go first, but I think it's a lot better now. But I think the approach to the management of levels across a site and the management of material that's generated by a site was often an afterthought. These days, it seems to be coming up to the top of people's agenda in something that needs to be investigated, and how you can do it properly to make a site work.
We had Toby Craden on one of our podcast episodes earlier, actually, going through cut and fill and why material matters. So that was a big topic that Toby covered. How about you, Lee? What would you say the biggest thing that falls through the gap?
It's the reliance that planning conditions solve everything, as in, we don't need to deal with it now. We'll get a series of planning conditions and we'll deal with that at the time. And um, uh, uh, an unwieldy planning permission can have a very long list of planning conditions that are rather complicated, very lengthy, will take a lot of work to resolve. I think that is resolvable by, again, providing detail and information ahead of time, so that the planning officers and the technical officers in the planning authority, with a much higher degree of clarity, write their planning conditions knowing that you've already proven the deliverability, and therefore the planning conditions can be a little more relaxed, a little less in numbers, and a little softer. So it just transitions through to Richard's detail engineering, all the better for it. So yeah, I think people lean into, we'll deal with it then through planning condition a bit too hard, and sometimes common stuff.
Fab. Well, thank you both. That was a really interesting episode, and finding out where those gaps are that overlap and those gaps are that maybe, show the fact that civil engineering and sort of planning and things can obviously happen separately too. So if people want to get in touch with you to ask any questions or potentially talk about their site, how can they get in touch? Richard, we'll come to you first.
Yeah, the best way is probably via email, which is richard.moorcroft@brookbanks.com.
Fab. And you, Lee?
Same for me, Sophie. So email's best at lee.witts@brookbanks.com.
Fantastic. Lovely. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Brookbanks Podcast.